So yeah, last time we created this portal so we could connect multiple levels. And so what we're going to do today, after we set up the UI, is go over a couple things that are kind of similar to the portal, but basically how do we connect events that happen in the game with other parts of the game. Um, and so the thing that we haven't really talked about, we've used all of these different components, except for we haven't created our own UI so far. And we haven't created signals, our own signals. We've used signals, but we haven't actually created signals. Those are the two main things that I want to cover today. But at this point, as we start to combine these topics and do more complicated things, it kind of cuts across a lot of different things. So um, we're gonna add a bunch of stuff, and I'll try to keep it simple and explain everything that we're working on. Um, but yeah, there's gonna be a good amount of new things that we're gonna add in. If you do have questions, feel free to interrupt me at any point. We can go over it. But the first thing I want to do, I'm going to add some UI, and I'm going to start with a menu. That's kind of the main thing that your UI is going to be used for. We don't really have a menu in the game. Like when we open the game, it just starts. And that's not usually how a game starts. So I'm not going to like actually go through and create all the assets for a menu. But I'm just going to show you how to build the basic building blocks. And then if you want to make something that's more elaborate, you can do that. So I'm going to start by creating a new scene. I'm just going to click the plus button. And so we have the 3D scene. That's what we've made so far. But what I'm going to start with here is the user interface, the green circle. And this is going to be my menu. So I'm going to call this menu. And you can see we're in a 2D interface, right? So, it's the same interface and the same basic controls. Like I can scroll, zoom in and out, I can pan, but there's no rotation, right? It's not like in a 3D world where I can rotate around. So this is just the 2D canvas that's going to be overlaid on top of our 3D world, or it can be its own thing. And the UI in Godot has a very specific way of working, and so I'm going to kind of like show you guys why in a way that I hope will make sense, but I'm going to kind of do things a little bit backwards. But for my menu, I'm going to keep it really simple. I'm just going to have a start button and a quit button. You might have like multiple levels, so you could have buttons for different levels. You might have like an instruction scene that you want to go to. You could also use these UI scenes to do like cutscenes. Like if you have like a narrative that you want to go in between your different game scenes, you could use 2D scenes to do the narrative. So there's actually a lot that you can do with this 2D scene, but we're just going to do a basic UI. So I'm going to add two buttons. I'm going to click on the menu section and then click the plus. And what we're looking at is inside this control section. So if I go into control, you can see there's all these different UI types, and they're useful for different things. We're just going to use a couple of them. We're going to use a button. So to find that, there's this base button, and there's a few different types of buttons. I'm just going to use a default button. But if you want to design your own buttons or download some, open source game art or something like that, you could use a texture button, which has different slots for the different styles. So like, buttons usually have like a active state and a hover state. I'm just going to use the basic button. So this is going to use just the standard stuff. So I'm going to click create here, and it creates this little button down here. If I zoom in, it's pretty small. Unfortunately, there's not a lot I can actually do with the design of these buttons that doesn't either take a lot of time or, take making my own art. So I'm not going to do that. But if you guys want to do that, there's a lot of tutorials on how to do that, and I can also go over some basics about it. But for my button, all I'm really going to do is I'm going to use their default styles, and I'm just going to put some text in here. So this is going to be my start button. And that's pretty much it for the design. I'm just going to leave everything else default. And that button is really, really small. So that's my start button. I'm going to rename this start. Okay, and then I want a quit button. So I can make a new button, or I could just duplicate this. Just going to duplicate this and call this one quit. So then I have to change the text here. So I'm going to change the text to quit. And then notice that our quit button is just directly on top of our start button. So that looks kind of weird. I can like move this over, But Godot actually doesn't really want you to do that. It's kind of strange. Oh, I haven't saved the scene. I always have to save the scene. I forgot to do that. So I'm gonna hit save, go to scenes, and just call this menu.tscn. Okay, so if I run this, okay, so it keeps the buttons there, but it's not very well designed. Like they're just kind of like in the corner over here. Uh-oh. I didn't give myself a way to get out of here. I forget what the key is to, oh, this is not what I want. I think it's F6. No, it's F8. There we go, F8. Okay. So I can drag these around, but that's not really how Godot wants me to do these layouts. It wants me to use other nodes to do the layout. So if you use the Godot UI system a lot, you'll get used to it. But basically, if I want to do something simple, like put these buttons on top of each other, what Godot really wants me to use is a VBox container. So if I go in here and type in container, see there's all these different types of containers that set up your scene in different ways. So I could set them next to each other or on top. I'm going to choose VBox and click create. And so now it doesn't affect them, but if I put them inside the VBox container, the VBox container is going to set them up to be on top of each other. So then maybe I want them to be in the center of the scene instead of the top left. That looks kind of weird. So if I want to do that, I need a different type of container, which is a center container. So I can click the plus again here. There's my center container. You can see there's a whole bunch of these. There's a grid. There's split containers. There's all sorts of different stuff. A scroll container. So I can't go over all of these, but there's different ways to do stuff. Okay, so now I'm going to put my VBox container inside my center container. Okay, there's still stuff on the left there, but notice the center container has access to something that the VBox container doesn't, which is this layout setting. So I can click on this layout setting. If I just want it to be fully centered, I can just click that. If I want to put it specifically somewhere, like over here or over there, or maybe down here, I can do that. But for now, I'm just going to do full rect. Okay, so now we've got a menu. So now let's actually connect our buttons to do something. And so we're going to create another script for this. So this script is going to be a little more complicated than the script we wrote last week, but it's really not doing too much more. So I'm going to click on the menu node. I always, almost always, not always, but typically I want to add a script to the main node. And so I'm going to click on the main node here, and then go down to script and click new. And I'm going to do an empty template, and I want to make sure to put this in my scripts folder. As I've mentioned, I like to keep things in the same folders. You don't have to do it that way, but that's my preference. So I'm going to put menu.gd inside my script folder and then click create. So it says extends control. That's what this type of UI thing is referred to in Godot as a control node. And basically what I want for my script to do, it's actually a little bit similar to my portal script. Remember our portal script, we had a level that we wanted to load. So I can actually just copy and paste this over for my, I'm going to grab that line and then go back to menu and paste this in. And then another thing we're going to want to do later is actually add the menu into the scene. So I'm going to make a setting here that I'm going to export for what type of menu is. So I'm going to say export variable is menu scene. And this is, I'm going to default this to be true. And you'll see why I'm going to need this in a little bit. But basically, if this scene is just a scene by itself, then I want to say it's a menu scene. And if it's not, if it's embedded on top of another scene, like we're going to do in a little bit, then I'm going to turn that setting off. Okay, so we'll look at why we want to do that in a second. So now let's connect our buttons to our script. So I'm going to click on my start button, go over to the node section. And for the buttons, there's some special events, button down, button up, button pressed. You can do a lot of stuff with this, like I can add sounds to the buttons using these events. But I'm just going to use the basic. I'm going to use pressed here and connect it to my menu. And then here, if I start the start button, what I want to do is load whatever level I put in here. So that's also the same code as my portal that I used over here. So I'm just going to copy this code from my portal and go back to the menu. And I'm going to replace this thing that Godot created with this. And let's just review this real quick. So if this load level that I want to load exists to avoid errors, then we're going to get the scene tree and change the scene to whatever that level is. So I can put whatever level I want in there in my editor. Okay, so that was pretty easy. Let's add our quit button. So same thing, I'm going to click on quit, and then I have to select the node tree over here, double click pressed, connect it to my menu. And so when I click the quit button, I just want to quit the scene. And so there's a way to do that. I just use get tree. A lot of these things start with get tree. This gets me the scene hierarchy of the whole program. And then I think it's just quit. Yeah, so we can just say quit here. And so now I can quit the scene. There's a couple more things we're going to add in here, but not quite yet. So let's try this. I'm going to go to the menu, go to the inspector, and I have to choose the load level. So I'm going to click on here and go to my scenes, and I'm going to load level 1. And then is menu scene, I'm going to leave that on because this main menu scene is a menu scene. So now I should be able to run this. And so I have my start and my quit button. So if I click quit, that quits the program. And if I click start, then I load into my first level. Okay, so let's exit out of there. So that wasn't too bad. We're going to add a few more things in here, but this will be useful. One of the things that we want to do is make sure that once we create the menu, we want to be able to use it in different places, right? We don't want to have to create a new menu for every scene. So just like our components, we want to make sure that we have ways of, adding this menu into our levels. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else we need to do here. I don't think quite yet. We're going to add some more stuff in just a second. Okay, so let's go back to level 1 and let's add our menu in here. And so I'm going to click on level 1, and now I can instance a copy of the menu. So I'm going to click on this instance button and type in menu. And there's my scenes menu. Okay, so there's my menu. And so let's move this up here. Okay, so if I run my scene now, there's my menu. But I don't actually want it to show up yet, right? So let's exit out of here. So we're going to fix a few things, but that's what it's going to look like, when we toggle the menu. Okay, so let's fix a couple things here. We're going to have to move some stuff around, but I'm just going to set this up in a pretty conventional way. So when we're inside of my level, I want to turn the menu scene off. So here, we're already inside the level. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of the start button. And I'm going to make the menu scene hidden by default. So that's actually pretty easy to do. And you can do this with all the other buttons. I'm just using a couple examples. You may have more buttons. You can kind of decide. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to add a new function into my menu script. So I'm on menu.gd. And I'm going to add a function called _ready. This is a special Godot function that runs at the beginning of the scene on whatever script we put it in. So we can, before the scene actually starts, we can check some of the parameters and then decide what to do. So what we can do is say if not is menu scene. So we're just asking, this is just a simple conditional statement. If we have this is menu scene, and we're just saying if this isn't a menu scene, first of all, we want to set visible to false. So the visible parameter just refers to the menu node itself. And so we're just going to go ahead and turn that menu node off. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this start button and hide it as well. So I'm going to say, well, actually, this is going to be a little tricky to find. But okay, yeah, I should have renamed these. But basically what I can do, I want to find that start button. So I'll start with a $sign. and just find it. I'll just use the menu to find it. There's the start button. And then that has its own visible property. The visible property is this little eyeball here. And so I'm going to set that to false. So if I'm not in the menu scene itself, I don't really need that start button. I just need the quit button, right? If I have other buttons like instructions or, you know, save or something like that, I can add those buttons later. But I'm just going to start with these two buttons. I don't really need it there. Okay, but we do want our menu to be visible, right? So we're going to borrow some code from the player controller uh, that basically says when we hit the escape key, we're going to show the menu. So I'm going to add that right here. So I'm going to go to my player controller. Scroll down a little bit, and then this func input, this is sort of like the ready function. Anything that has an underscore at the beginning, that means it's like a Godot thing. And so if I go in here, this is processing all of the events. So all the key presses, mouse presses, all of that stuff from the user. And you can see there's the very first line of code here says if event.isActionPressed UI cancel, that's mapped to the escape key. You could map it to other keys. Then it just immediately quits the game. Now that we have a menu, we don't need to do this anymore. So we're going to put this in our menu, and we're going to change what it does here in a second. So I'm going to grab this. I'm going to copy this and go to the menu and just paste this whole thing. Actually, I need this whole section. So let's go. I'm going to copy this whole bit, paste it in here. So now, instead of quitting the game, when I hit cancel, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set visible here to the opposite. So this is a really simple trick to toggle something. I'm going to say visible equals exclamation point visible. This means the opposite of visible. Exclamation point in programming and code always means the opposite. So if visible is true, it's going to be set to false. If it's false, it'll be set to true. So we know that we set the visibility of the menu to false at the beginning because we're not in a menu scene. And now if I hit the cancel button, we're going to toggle that visibility. Okay, so let me go back to the player controller, and I'm just going to comment this out for now. I'm not going to delete it. I might want to use it later. So I'm going to hit Control K to add a little comment to the beginning of both of these lines. So it's not going to do that anymore. And now I'll be able to quit using the menu. So let's give that a try. I'm going to select level 1 and hit play. Okay, so now I'm playing the game. If I hit escape, now we have a quit button. And I can't do anything with it because I didn't get my mouse back, right? So I need to also get my mouse back. And then optionally, once I bring up the UI, I might want to pause the player's movement. You don't have to do that, but it might make sense. I'm gonna have to use but the easiest thing to do is just make sure the metrics is up here. Okay, so now let's make a little apple that I can collect in the scene. And I'm eventually going to turn this into its own thing as usual, but let's just start building it in the scene. So I'm just going to make a spatial node for my trees just to clean this up a little bit. I have a lot of trees sitting around. I'll just drag that in there. Okay, let's make an apple. So I'm going to click plus, I'm going to make a spatial node. Actually, I want to interact with this thing, so I need an area, like my portal. So I'm going to make an area, and I'll rename this apple. And so as with most things, we need a mesh, and we need a collider. So let's add a collision shape. And so for our collision shape, we'll use a circle or a sphere. And that, oh no, it's going to be that big. That's a decent size. It's pretty small down there. So that's pretty good. Let's go to our mesh. And so we want to match that. So we'll use a sphere. And let's make it already the same height. That's actually a decent size. I'm not even going to edit that. So let's just add a material. New spatial. We'll make it red to match the apple. And maybe I'll add in one of my little grid textures since I have it. That one. And let's make sure you set the UV to triplanar. And I'm going to reset this later, but let's move it a little more visible. And make it a little bit brighter. Okay. Looks good enough. So let's take my apple. And so basically we want to know when we run into this apple. So just like our portal, what we're going to do is we're going to make a script for the apple that knows when something enters it. The thing that is new is that once we enter the apple, we're going to create our own custom signal to send to our metric script. Okay, so let's go to our apple and make a new script here. And I want to make sure this is in the scripts folder. Apple.gd, that's good. Okay, so this extends an area. So the first thing we want to do is know when the player runs into it. So we're going to connect our apple to itself. We're just going to go to the node tree, body entered, that's going to be the player. Double click on that. And we're going to connect this to itself. So we got to find the apple and click connect. Okay. So one of the things we're going to do when we get the apple is we're going to make the apple disappear. That's actually pretty easy. We just use this function called queueFree. That just takes this apple out of the scene. But before we do that, we want to tell our metrics to increase our counter. So to do that, we need to create our own signal. And we also need to be careful because when we enter the apple, there could be multiple, because Godot is using different timing for different components, like the physics versus the rendering, etc. You might trigger the apple more than once without intending to. So we're going to use a little toggle here to make sure that we can only trigger the apple once. So we're going to say variable is collected equals false. So we want to know that this apple has not been collected yet. So then we need a signal, and we'll just call this signal collected. That's all we have to do right there. We just give the signal a name. A signal will add a new event to our node tree that we can connect to another script in our scene. So first we want to check if not is collected. So we don't want to collect the apple more than once. So this is a very common programming method to check something. So then we just set is collected to true. Okay, so that way, if we trigger it multiple times, the first time we trigger it, we toggle this value, so the next time we go through, we know that we've already triggered it. Then we're going to send our signal. So we're going to say emit signal. That's how we send a signal out. And then we can just choose the collected signal. And that's in quotation marks. I don't really know why they do it that way, but that's how they look it up. I guess it makes sense because there's no variable for this. Anyway, so that's a little bit like our portal. It's a little bit more complex because we're doing a couple more things. But we're almost done. We just have to connect our new signal that we just invented here to our metrics. Okay, so we're going to go back to the apple. And if I click on this again, there we go. There's our new collected signal. So this is a completely brand new signal that we created. And so I'm going to double click on that and connect it to our metrics. So then on apple collected, all we have to do here, we're going to increase our apple count. So we're going to say apple count equals apple count plus 1. We're just going to add 1 to the number of apples we've collected. But then we have to actually update our display. So if I go to my metrics scene, we're going to have to get this label and set the value there. So I'm going to use the $sign to get one of my components and use the label. And this one's easy. I'm just going to say .text equals apple count. The only trick here is that apple is a number and text is expecting something called a string, which is like a string of values. So it's going to throw an error if I do this, but what I can do is just put my number into a string. So I can use capital S string to basically convert this number from a number into a string, which is what is text is using. Okay, so I'm basically done now. Let's test this out. So when I run into my apple, it should increase my apple count. Okay, there we go. Now my apple count is 1. So that's kind of exciting. I can start to collect items. So now I can take my apple and let's make it into its own scene. So I'm going to say save branches scene and go to scenes, and this is just apple.tscn. And so now I can actually edit the apple over here. Of course, I'm going to reset the transform. If I have a separate scene, I want to make sure it's centered. That's going to help me design stuff in the future. And when I go back to my level, now that apple is going to be over there. So let's move it up here. And let's make a couple copies. I'm going to duplicate it. Now I'm going to duplicate all 3 of these at once. Okay, so now I have some apples to collect. We could also add stuff in here. So the nice thing that once you have this apple, if I go back to my apple here, I could add like a simple animation or something. Yeah, we have a few more minutes before I want to switch to workshop time. So let's add in a really simple animation just to attract a little bit more attention to the apple. So I'm going to click on the main node of the apple, and let's use an animation player. There's a lot of different complicated animation things that you can do in Godot. I'm just going to go over a really basic one. So with an animation player, we can animate any of the different properties of our objects. So I can take my animation player. It has kind of a specific workflow, but basically I click on this animation, create a new one. And there's a lot of stuff we could do. We could make it bounce. We could make it spin. We could do different stuff with it. I'm going to make it spin. So I'm going to call this animation spin. And then I'm going to click on this little button so it auto plays when it loads. So I don't have to tell it to play with a script because I don't really want to use a whole script to do that. Okay, so then I'm going to add the track. When I want to make an animation, these are all the different types of things that I can animate. So I can animate properties, parts of my 3D transform, curves, audio, all sorts of different stuff. So let's do a 3D transform. of the main apple. Uh, and what I have to do now, this is kind of cool. Once I go to the apple, see all these keys here that just got added? These are keyframes that I can add to save states. So for example, if I want to rotate, if I click on the key right here, I'm going to say use Bezier curves. It added these rotations in here. And so if I scroll over in my animation and I change something, so I want to rotate around this is the y-axis. So I'm going to rotate 360 degrees on y. See, it added this little reset button, so I can always reset that if I want. And then I just click the keyframe again, and see how it added this animation for me? And so now if I play the animation, it's playing. It should loop. Oh no, I have to hit the loop button. Where's the loop button? Oh, it's over here. Okay, let's loop it. So it's a Bezier curve, which is why it slows down a little bit at the end. If I click on the curve, you can kind of edit that if I want to, but you don't need to. This gets a lot more complex. But I can also increase the duration of the animation, so I can select these keyframes and drag them if I want it to go a little bit slower. I don't know why that stopped. Oh, the whole animation, I guess, has to be. Eh, oh, why this window is not. Oh, maybe I need to set it to 2 seconds. I don't actually use this all that much because. Oh, here we go. 2 seconds. Okay, there we go. Okay, so you can change the duration. Yeah, that's the full time there. That's the loop button. And then you can loop different properties down here. And then you can also delete things. Like we don't really need this one, so I can delete it. It'll work the same way, although apparently not. Okay, anyway, there's a lot more you can do with that. I'm just going to leave this here. So if we go back to our level, the apples should start spinning on load, hopefully. Yeah, there we go. So that makes them a little bit more maybe appealing. Well, it looks like I broke the metrics. I probably have to reconnect. Oh shoot, I should have done that before. Oh yeah, so it reset my collected thing. So let's set that there. So that's reconnected now, but now it's not going to be all my apples. So let's go back and just delete. The one thing when you're designing the scene, usually I don't want to go through and click on every single apple and add that connect. So it's almost easier to just duplicate them and drag them around. Kind of depends on how complicated your scene is, but I'd rather, duplicate all these apples than have to click on every single one and reset the signal. Okay, I'm just going to clean this up a little bit. I'm going to put a spatial node in here. Call this apples. And let's put these all in there. So that's a little bit cleaner. And let's just test it one more time. Okay, so I've got 1 apple, 2, 5, 6. And of course, you could add a sound when you collect the apple. There's a lot of other stuff you can do with that. Okay, so I think that's good. I'm going to upload these scripts. So if you guys want to use those scripts, you can get them from my GitHub, and I'll post that in the Discord. But I think that's good for this. So I'm going to stop here.